Number 5 on this list is the haunting in Connecticut. This haunting is the haunting of the Snedeker family. Listverse writes, after renovations on the house were complete, Carmen Snedeker entered the basement for the first time. There, she found embalming equipment and body tags with the names of the deceased. The family soon realized that the house was infested with demons. Carmen witnessed the water in her mop bucket turn a different color. She recalled the mop water was blood red. I mean a deep, deep red. It made my skin crawl. The middle son said the lights were coming on and off and on and off even though there was no bulbs in it. Ed and Lorraine Warren assisted in performing an exorcism on the house, which has brought closure to the family. Since then, no further paranormal activity has occurred. The Snedeker family remained in the house for 2 more years before they relocated to Tennessee. So guys, all of this is well and good, and it's what the Warrens want you to believe. Is it true? Probably not. You see, they had someone come in and write a book about the events that happened here. He went in and interviewed the family multiple times, and it turns out that they couldn't keep their story straight at all. They were all over the place, and it felt like nobody actually knew what happened. Then he went to Ed and told Ed that he can't write this story because nobody has any idea what actually went down. And you know what Ed said? Just make it up. That's literally what happened, guys. The story about this place is just made up, and it was probably never even true to begin with. Also, while literal mop buckets were filling up with blood downstairs, the upstairs neighbor was totally fine and just living their life. Seems kinda strange that the demonic possession would differentiate between floors, but I guess that's what the Warrens want you to think. Number 4 on this list is the vampire girl. Now this is one of those cases that, if it's true, doesn't get enough of the limelight. The Warrens have dealt with werewolves before, and we actually looked into the South End werewolf and what it's all about in one of our previous videos. But this vampire case, it never really gets talked about. The Warrens were brought in to deal with an 18-year-old girl who was going down a path of vampirism. This girl was very interested in death and the underworld. She started performing satanic rituals by herself and, as you'd expect, ended up becoming possessed. The possession was clearly vampiric in nature, and the demon was hungry for blood. It's said that she would wait in cemeteries for unsuspecting victims and then attack them right when they got there. It was reported that 16 people were bitten by this girl, and she would actually drink their blood. To my knowledge, nobody was killed, but there were obviously some pretty serious injuries involved. Now what strikes me as odd is why this case hasn't been discussed more. It almost feels a bit like a secret because it's never brought up and largely forgotten about. Yet, when you consider what actually happened and the events that transpired, this is one of the most shocking things they ever did. The fact that we don't bring up this case and talk about it more actually leads me to believe that if there is any truth to be had in the Warrens' exploits, it might be here. Maybe they were actually trying to protect the world from the truth here. The truth that vampires are potentially real. Number 3 on this list is Ed's relatives. This is something that really doesn't get mentioned a lot, but Ed Warren saw demons just like the rest of the people he tried to help. I think the media often portrayed the Warrens as these almost superhuman individuals who were impervious to the will of paranormal entities, but Ed certainly struggled with this growing up and for much of his life. Apparently, Ed would be frequented by the ghosts of long-past family members. These paranormal entities would speak to him and tell him to do things. He was pretty private about what they would say to him, but we know that he did in fact get frequented by them. Who knows what they could have told him to do though, or how long he was seeing these visions. I think the reason that this was kept under wraps for a while was to preserve Ed's image as the person who comes in and saves people from these paranormal entities, rather than potentially somebody who suffers from them as well. Number 2 on this list is Arne Johnson. This is the infamous Devil Made Me Do It case. Arne Johnson killed his landlord in 1981 by stabbing him to death. When he was brought to court though, he claimed that he was not in control of his actions and the devil literally possessed him and made him do it. Now this is pretty serious stuff, so how does Ed and Lorraine Warren fit in? Well, it's been speculated that Ed and Lorraine might have made the entire thing up, which effectively means that they were trying to get a murderer to go free based on a blatant lie lie. Johnson had a brother-in-law whose name was David. David was mentally ill. He needed professional help. The Warrens saw this as an opportunity and decided to try and exploit it. They came in and tried to manipulate the family to say that David was initially possessed with a demon and that Johnson came in, told the demon to take his body instead, and saved David from said demon. If the public believed this, then the Warrens would be smack dab in the center of a massive demon case. David and his family would get a lot of money from publicity deals, and the murderer Johnson would get off scot-free. It was a win-win-win for everyone except the justice system. Well, David's family wasn't happy about it after some thinking. They ended up suing the Warrens, claiming that they manipulated them and tried to get a guilty man to walk free, which, if everything that I just said is true, they did actually do. Just another secret that came out that they didn't want to be revealed. And finally, number 1 on this list is Annabelle. In our last part of the series, we were breaking down some of the Warrens' cases and talking about how some of them may have been fraudulent. Well, a lot of you were commenting on that video asking about one of their most famous cases that I haven't brought up yet. Annabelle. The Annabelle doll is one of the most widely known cases that the Warrens participated in and would probably be on most people's lists when it comes to the creepiest dolls to ever exist. This doll even inspired the creation of a horror franchise of the same name that's had 3 separate installments in it. Pretty good notoriety for an inanimate object. Or maybe inanimate is the wrong word when talking about Annabelle. The legend began back in the 1970s when a young nurse named Donna received the doll as a gift from her mother. The doll took up residence on her sofa and at first was a nice and calming little plush toy that had nothing demonic about it at all. Soon things started getting a little bit weird though. Donna would go to work and find things out of place or doors open that weren't that way when she left. Then her and her roommate started finding notes around the apartment. Tiny little scribbled notes on parchment paper that would read, "Help me." Finally, it all came bubbling up when Lou, Donna's boyfriend, was in her apartment one afternoon by himself. The most common version of the story says that he was napping and then woke up to the doll literally trying to kill him, strangling him until he finally had enough strength to throw it off of him. Apparently he even had several scratch marks on him for a few days, but then they went away after that. This is when Ed and Lorraine entered into the mix. They took the story and absolutely ran with it. Apparently, as they were taking this doll, which they had determined was possessed, as they were taking it back to a safe place, it tried to crash their car several times, and only putting holy water on it would stop this interference. Of course, no one else was actually in the car at the time, so we just sort of need to take their words for it. And that's actually the thing with this story. The only actual evidence or proof about this doll is that they told people it was haunted. There's no video of it moving, there's no pictures of it acting crazy. Anytime I've seen it, it just looks like a regular doll. Because of this, we can't say that it's fake, but we also can't really say that it's real either. I will say, after everything we revealed in the last video, I'm starting to have a hard time just accepting what Ed and Lorraine tell me. So honestly, Annabelle being fake could definitely have been another one of those secrets that they just didn't want us knowing about. Number 5 on this list is the Dark Magic Doll. Yep, anything called the Dark Magic Doll is probably something I don't want to know about. That's most likely why Ed and Lorraine locked this thing up in their museum, because it's really not something that should be out in the public world for anyone to have. We've all heard about voodoo dolls before and the potential powers that they can have. Dolls that are made through some sort of dark ritual with the power to then affect people on a real life basis. Usually these dolls are made with a singular person in mind, and the doll that's created can only ever affect that one person. The same principle applies to this magic doll. However, the thing with this one is that from my understanding, you don't need to make it with only one person in mind. Simply using the doll while picturing an individual should create the same effect as a voodoo doll. It's said to use this thing, you need to hang it from its neck, and then the person that you have in mind is gonna get sick and eventually die. Now, I'm not sure if you can use this doll more than once, or if it's just a one-off, but it's probably a good thing that the public doesn't know such information. Think about how dangerous this doll actually is, especially if it got into the hands of the wrong person. Somebody who wanted to inflict harm onto someone else could easily do so from the comfort of their own home, and nobody would be the wiser. To make this doll requires some pretty dark rituals and some sinister magic, but the Warrens were pretty secretive about the exact process of constructing this thing, and again, probably for the best. Having information like that out in the open on how to make such a deadly and dangerous doll just isn't safe for anybody. Right now, the only known doll is currently locked up in the Ed and Lorraine Warren Museum. Hopefully it stays there and we don't ever see any more of these creepy things popping up in the world again. Number 4 on this list is the Smurl haunting. So we've all heard about Amityville and we've heard about the Enfield poltergeist, but one haunting that didn't get talked about nearly as much was the Smurl haunting. Maybe it's because it was just a little bit too scary and the Warrens didn't want to release such information to the public. An article discussing the 7 best cases from Ed and Lorraine writes, in 1974, Jack and Jeanette Smurl moved into a house on Chase Street, West Pittston, Pennsylvania. Strange occurrences followed, leading the Smurls to believe that a demon possessed their home. They claimed the demon had slammed their German Shepherd into a wall, bit Jack's ear, and pushed one of their daughters down a flight of stairs. Both Jack and Janet were said to have been assaulted by the demon. In 1986, they contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, who confirmed that their house was indeed haunted. Ed Warren would go on to say that he had witnessed a dark mass form inside the home and that the demon had left him a message telling him to get out. Now, one thing that I think gets glossed over a little bit in this article is the time that these people moved into their home compared to the time that Ed and Lorraine actually showed up. 1974 is when they entered this house, and Ed and Lorraine didn't get there until 1986. These people were living in a home that was severely haunted, so much so that they were getting assaulted by a demon, and they were living there for over 10 years. I think we think about haunting sometimes as being like a week-long scary event or something like that, but this was literally over a decade of living in absolute fear. Why this family didn't move is beyond me, but maybe they were scared this creature would just keep following them wherever they go. I think this is why this one doesn't get talked about as much. 6 months is one thing, but 10 years is totally different. Ed and Lorraine knew that and probably didn't want to scare the public into thinking that they could get haunted for potentially their entire lives. Number 3 on this list is the African fertility dolls. Tony Spera goes into detail about these dolls on the official Ed and Lorraine YouTube channel, and the story is pretty creepy. Apparently these dolls, which are now in their possession, were originally from Africa. They were made by an African witch doctor, but were then stolen from him and brought back to America. They were sent to a police officer who was in on the theft and thought that he could get some serious value for some authentic African fertility dolls. What he didn't expect was for these dolls to take his life. After he acquired these dolls, he soon became paralyzed from the neck down and, after some time, succumbed to this disease and died. These dolls are cursed, and after stealing them from their respective owner, took the life of those who were responsible. Now they're in the museum, and Tony warns us on the YouTube channel about ever touching them, for a similar fate could happen to us. It's stuff like this that really flew under the radar during Ed and Lorraine Warren's time. But the fact that these dolls exist, and there are probably many more of them in the world, is truly very terrifying. Number 2 on this list is the South End werewolf. Born and bred in the Essex seaside town of Southend, the first inkling of trouble came when William Ramsey was just 9 years old. Like any normal child, he was outside in his back garden when he began to feel strange. It was deep into one Saturday afternoon in 1952 when an icy blast of frigid cold swept over him. Perspiration froze on his skin and a foul stench came close to making him vomit. The bewildered youngster only had 2 things on his mind: running away to a life on the ocean wave and wolves. By this time he was close to the garden fence, and only the calls of his mother brought him out of whatever had gripped him. However, something else took complete control of him instead. Intense and pure rage had installed itself firmly within his psyche. Using this and the adrenaline-fueled strength he now possessed, he had uprooted a fence post with the fence still attached to it and was swinging it like a club. Not even his parents could easily remove the post with their bare hands. That was a passage written by Les Hewitt talking about the beginning of the Southend werewolf case. This incident was the beginning of a long road for Bill. For 15 years, though, he didn't have another episode until he started having dreams. Dreams that his wife would look at him and run off in fear after seeing him. These eventually ceased, but then 15 more years later at a party, it all came out. Apparently on the drive back home from this party, Bill lost it. He turned into a complete animal and the wolf came out. Scratching and biting at the driver, Bill had completely turned into a werewolf. His body changed too. His shoulders hunched, his nails grew to claws, his humanity had completely left him. The Warrens were then brought in to help him and had to perform several exorcisms to get rid of this werewolf presence. Think about this entire story though. Bill, to my knowledge, hadn't been bitten by a werewolf or had any extended exposure to one. He just became one. How scary is that? At any given point, I could just slowly start to develop werewolf-like characteristics and turn into a rabid super beast. I think that's why this case didn't get as much media coverage as some of the other ones. Just the fact that something like this could happen, and I mean, that could really scare the public. And finally, number 1 on this list is the Shadow Doll. So we already talked about some other dolls, but this takes it to a whole nother level. You know the horror movie franchise Chucky? Where the doll is possessed with a serial killer and it's out to get people, like that whole bit? Well, this doll makes Chucky look like the sort of thing you invite to your kid's birthday party. Yeah, it's pretty freaking bad. The Shadow Doll, for one, looks absolutely terrifying. It looks like this woman with a white face totally covered in black robes with chains and spikes sticking out of her. It's apparently made of bones and even has a human tooth in it. Now, even though this doll doesn't operate like Chucky and move around in the real world, it does something even more terrifying. Anytime you go to sleep, you aren't safe if the Shadow Doll has you in its sights. It's said that this grotesque looking creature will come to you while you're sleeping in your dreams and terrorize you. It isn't said to be a quick kill either, like this thing's pretty sadistic in how it haunts you. It will keep coming back over and over and over again until finally it terrorizes you to a point where your heart literally stops out of fear and you never wake up. Think about how horrible that would be. To be absolutely terrified of going to sleep because you know that the second you close your eyes, this shadow doll could be upon you and it might be your last night ever. Similar to the other dolls that we talked about, this thing is locked up in the museum, but I personally don't think that's enough. I know that the Warrens like to show this stuff off, but honestly, screw it. This thing is far too dangerous, burn it with some fire, and let's be done with it. Number 5 on this list is the relationship. As we'll look at a bit later in this video, Ed and Lorraine's relationship might not have been all it was cracked up to be. The couple that inspired The Conjuring have often been talked about as being one of the greatest married couples ever. In the movie The Conjuring, the pair very clearly have each other's back, and it's clear that there's a deep foundation of love between them. Or at least that's how the movie likes to show it. Real life may have been a lot different. Judith Penny was someone who would have had access to the Warrens' relationship and would have been able to see it behind closed doors. We'll get into why that is the case later and explain who Judith Penny is, but for now, just take my word for it. Apparently, she has come out and said that the Warrens' beautifully loving relationship that we saw on screen is all a bunch of baloney. In truth, Ed was extremely violent and toxic to Lorraine. This toxicity would manifest itself in many different forms. Oftentimes, it would come out in harsh, verbal abuse that felt as if it was coming right from thin air, totally unprovoked by Lorraine. However, occasionally this would manifest into physical abuse. Judith has come out and said that one particularly bad evening, she saw Ed backhand Lorraine across the face with all his might, and apparently she lost consciousness. Now, Lorraine wouldn't just sit there and take the abuse either, she would fire her own shots as well. Judith thought that some evenings one of them wouldn't even be waking up the next morning based on how much they were fighting and how intense it would get. This has all the telltale signs of a horribly toxic relationship. The pair were just very good at hiding it. Number 4 on this list is the Amityville horror story. I feel like you've heard this story before, guys. Arguably the most famous of all the Ed and Lorraine Warren cases, this singular case launched the pair onto the main stage as being some of the biggest demonologists and paranormal investigators on the planet. Therefore, it was incredibly important to their image and their brand that this story was believed by the public. Fact of the matter is, though, they made the entire thing up. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was the spark behind this entire story. In 1974, Ronald gunned down his entire family in that home for seemingly no reason. He was later sentenced to life in prison for his crimes and died behind bars at age 69. These murders were brutal though and were heard nationwide. That's why when the next family to move in claimed the house was haunted, it actually got a ton of attention. The family said that slime would appear all over the place with no apparent origin. Things would swing open and objects would fly around the room. The house itself could simply not warm up and would stay incredibly cold for weeks on end. The media got wind of this, and so did Ed and Lorraine. They went into this place and went on to have their most successful case ever, ultimately concluding that the house is in fact haunted. However, this just simply was never true. The family's lawyer later came out and said that they collectively made up this story together and thought it would get a lot of traction over a few bottles of wine. The Warrens' initial success literally started by a few drunk people deciding they were gonna pull a trick on everyone. Even though this news came out, the Warrens have always held strong onto the fact that the house was in fact haunted. Number 3 on this list is Judith Penny. Ed and Lorraine Warren were married right up until Ed died back in 2006. The couple had been together for a long time and shared quite the life together. I mean, think about all the crazy things that they did. I highly doubt that many people can say that they stopped ghosts around the world and became famous together. While they were at the height of their success, they looked like a power couple. A real duo that you wouldn't want to trifle with. Ed and Lorraine Warren together taking on the world one ghost or possession at a time. Well, during all of that, although it looked like it was just the two of them, there was actually a third. Judith Penny has come forward and said in a sworn statement that she had a relationship with Ed Warren for 4 whole decades. 4 decades where they were having an intimate relationship that the world had no idea about. Apparently, Judith moved into the Warren household when she was 15 years old back in 1963. Ed, who was in his mid-30s at the time, would sleep with her regularly, and Lorraine Warren was well aware of the entire thing. I mean, she obviously was, considering Judith literally lived with the pair in their own house. In fact, before Ed's big career of being a demonologist took off, it said that he would drive Judith's bus to school. How freaking creepy and gross is that, guys? Literally her school bus driver, but also her lover while she's 15 years old. This relationship apparently went on until 2003, 3 years before Ed finally passed away. Obviously, the Warrens didn't want any of this getting out to anyone and kept it very hush-hush. She even had to have when she became pregnant with Ed's child, and that was kept under wraps. What we thought was this power duo was actually a sick and twisted trio that we knew nothing about. The Warren family, before Lorraine died, came out and said that they had no knowledge of the alleged conduct. Number 2 on this list is the Lady in White. The Lady in White was a ghost that was said to haunt the Union Cemetery in Connecticut. This was another one of the Warrens' most famous cases and gained a ton of notoriety. Well, sorry to burst your bubble, guys, but it's fake. Let's roll a clip of what is supposed to be evidence of the Lady in White. So first off, where the hell is the ghost there, and how on earth did this qualify as proof? Like, frankly, I hardly see anything at all, but even if I did, guess who's behind it? Judith. Yeah, the girl that Ed had an illegal relationship with was the Lady in White. Literally dressed up in a sheet, and the pair took some grainy pictures and videos together and claimed it was evidence. Just another secret that the Warrens tried to hide, but eventually it's bubbled to the surface. And finally, number 1 on this list is the smoke and the mirrors. We've already talked about the Amityville horror house and the Lady in White here, and about how they're all fake. Well, guess what, folks? I hate to do this to you, but they ain't the only ones. Everything the Warrens did was just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. The Smurl haunting saw other experts come in and look at the space. Nothing was wrong with it. Some of the exorcisms they performed, those people weren't really possessed by the devil. They were mentally ill people that the Warrens were preying on. The whole story about how they cured someone of being a werewolf, like, that doesn't even make any sense. Smoke and mirrors. That's what the Warrens' career was. Now, that's not to say that they didn't inadvertently stumble upon something paranormal every now and again. I mean, if you believe in that sort of stuff, then they must have, based on how active they were in the community. But basically, a lot of our favorite stories that rocketed them to the top of the demonology community are completely fraudulent. I guess it's not the worst thing in the world to know that we aren't living among as many ghosts as the pair claim that we were.